So the basic idea behind these things is this. When you enable remoting on a computer, I hope to goodness I've done it, get PS session configuration. PowerShell sets up several default session configurations. These are also called endpoints. Session configuration is sort of the PowerShell word for an endpoint. And the one that most of us connect to when we remote into a computer is the Microsoft.PowerShell one. That's the default. If you run a command like enter PS session or invoke command, it tries to connect to Microsoft.PowerShell by default unless you do something different. And you can see here that this has an access permission built into it that says administrators are allowed and members of the remote management users group are allowed. Once you're in that configuration, you can do pretty much anything you want to. For example, let's just take a look at it here, Microsoft.PowerShell. You can see that on these number of different things that they've pre-configured. This is a 64-bit. It supports a variety of options. There's no run as user, which means it's going to run your commands through delegation. This is all standard, remoting stuff. But what you can do is create your own session configurations, and you can make them extremely different than this one. So imagine for a moment that you've written a little application for your help desk. Maybe you did it in PowerShell Studio or something like that, and it's going to let them perform some task, enabling user accounts or resetting user passwords or whatever. You don't want to actually give them permission to do that. So in that little application you write, you let them pick a username and check boxes, whatever. The command that runs under the hood actually gets sent to a server in your data center. And on that server, you set up a delegated administration endpoint or session configuration. And here's the first step in that. New PS session configuration file. Now, this thing has got a number of different parameters in it, but essentially what this is doing is just creating a file on disk that defines what this new session configuration look like. You can specify a policy. You can say, I want to load these formats. I want to pre-import these modules. And this is the important one. You can specify a language mode. Now, the language mode can be full, meaning that if someone manually gets into this endpoint, they have full access to the PowerShell language, or you can start ratcheting that down, and you can make it less than the full language. You can put it into a mode called restricted remote server, which means it really doesn't have any language mode at all. You can't use variables. You can't use any of the scripting constructs. So there's really two steps to locking this down. So this language mode is the first of those. So you're going to create this. And the other thing this lets you do is specify visible functions, visible providers, and visible commandlets. So imagine that when someone gets into this endpoint, you pre-import, let's say, the Active Directory module, and rather than giving them all of those commands, you say the only one I'm going to make visible is set AD account password. That's the only command that's going to be in there. So once you create that file, the next thing you do, register PS session configuration. This command takes that file, reads it, and allows you to specify a few other things. There's a little bit of overlap here. For example, you can still do modules to import, but you can also specify a run as credential. That means any commands that get run in here will not be run under the credential of the person who connected, but they will be run under this instead. So you could make that, let's say, a domain administrator. So even if a non-administrator was connected to here, whatever commands you let them see would be run as this run as credential. So you're giving them the ability to do everything, but then you're restricting the actual tools they can get their hands on. So the other parameter you'll want to use, let me see if I can find it here, is security descriptor UI. You could specify a security descriptor SDDL, but that language is pretty intense. Show security descriptor UI just pops up a pretty standard user interface dialog box, so you can decide who will be allowed to connect to this endpoint. And the last thing you're going to want to lock down, you can find the last bit. Probably your processor architecture. You might want to do some other stuff. You're going to have to specify the name. And the name is what people will connect to. So here's the big picture. You create this little GUI app. You give it out to your administrators. They type usernames and click checkboxes, whatever. Inside the GUI app, it connects to this custom endpoint you've set up. And it runs a command to, let's say, reset a user's password. It's going to get the permission to do that because of this run as credential that you've given it. So it's going to run that command as that user, not as the help desk technician's user. And then it disconnects from the remoting session. If you've got a sneaky little help desk user and he figures out what that application is doing and he opens up PowerShell and he manually connects, he will still be allowed to connect. But he's not going to be able to do anything because only the command you gave him is even going to be there. So you determine who can connect with the security descriptor UI. You determine what commands are going to be available in the previous command, the new PS session configuration. You determine what credential those commands will run under, and you've got a whole bunch of other options in here that you can configure to kind of tweak things down a little bit. You can have a particular script run at startup if you want to. Whatever happen, you can make happen. So that's kind of the two-part, three-part way of making delegated administration. So that's kind of the 10,000-foot overview. Now, if you hop up to, and I'll just type this in a comment, if you go to PowerShell.com, that'll redirect you into PowerShell.org to a page, and there's a link for the free PowerShell.org ebooks. One of those is called Secrets of PowerShell Remoting, and there's an entire chapter that walks through this. One of the things you've got to be really, really careful about, in that previous command, this one, when you're specifying the language mode, let me show you the full help on this so you can see what the language mode options are. Because there's a security check here. So you can specify full language, and that lets someone do everything. You can also specify no language. Restricted language is a little bit tricky. One of the things I cover in the book is if you are going to set things to restricted language, then there is actually, for a knowledgeable user, a workaround that will get them basically the full language. It involves using the invoke operator and a script block. And it's kind of a known, I don't want to call it a bug, it's not, it's a known thing, but it's kind of a design issue. So just don't get too confident in what this does. You kind of need to understand some of the tiniest little permutations of how it operates. So I wanted to kind of cover this at a very, very high level first, let you guys ask questions if you want to. And if you want to go off topic and ask questions about the scripting game or the scripting games or the 2014 summit or anything, you can ask whatever you want to. There's a couple more things in here I'll get to before I wrap up, but I wanted to do a 10-minute overview of this to get you thinking about it, and then see if there was anything right away that you wanted to talk about. So, Mike, I guess people can just type questions.
Anybody who wants to, if they want to type or unmute and ask your question.
How does the session determine what profile or PS session config it's going to use? It's not based on user ID because a user could potentially have access to more than one of these. When you run a command like enter PS session or invoke command, one of the things you specify is the application name, the configuration name, and that is the configuration you are actually connecting to. So the default is Microsoft.PowerShell. If you created a new one, you could name it whatever you wanted, and then people would have to know, or you would have to give them a tool that knew when they do enter PS session or invoke command to specify the proper minus configuration name parameter. And so that's how it knows which one to connect to. And there it is on invoke command as well.
What about
no, go ahead.
What about sim sessions? Did it apply to those as well?
Let's see here. I've never set one up with these. those work a little bit differently, but I think they do still have the... Yeah. See, because those don't technically connect to PowerShell. Those connect to the SIM listener on the remote machine. They both go through remoting, but they don't both go through PowerShell. So SIM is probably hard-coded for its own configuration name, which gets registered, and that's probably the only one it'll connect to. Because the WMI repository permissions kind of come out in another place. One of the reasons that this whole idea of using these endpoints for this purpose hasn't gotten a lot of publicity is because it is still a multi-step process. You are probably unlikely to have people connecting in directly through a PowerShell console. Your GUI tool that runs PowerShell under the hood, and it connects to the delegated administration remoting endpoint. And I guess there's just enough discrete steps involved that the team didn't really kind of get into the groove of really promoting the heck out of this feature. But it is a really, really cool use. I think Workflow got a lot of the publicity for version 3, but I have a lot more folks who are using this in production environments because you can do some really cool stuff with it. If you think about what you can do with a proxy function, for example, I could write a proxy function, put it in a module, have that module preloaded into a delegated administration endpoint. Now, the real command would be loading in the background, but I could make that invisible because the proxy command would wrap around it and hide it, essentially. And I could use that proxy function to remove or add parameters. So I could really, by using a variety of these techniques, really significantly lock down what someone is able to do in one of these endpoints. Yeah, this does work well to do that, and you really can set it up in a neat way. You know, another thing, keep in mind, PowerShell is running all this remoting over HTTP or HTTPS. It's really easy to get that through a firewall. So even if you have external partners who need to come in and manage some little bit, you can really lock it down. Here's how well this works. It's exactly what Azure and Office 365 use. They do it through a slightly different technique. They've built it out a little bit more because they've got access to a lot of Visual Studio programmers, but they're using this exact same technique. You know, when I remote into my Office 365 installation, I get redirected off to my pod, the pod that serves my company. I can only touch the things that they allow me to touch. And this is exactly how the fan-in remoting scenario can be accomplished. You can have a lot of administrators, all with different responsibilities, remoting in one server, each of them connecting potentially to a different endpoint, and each of them getting exactly the functionality that you want them to have. So I did want to make this a real quick overview, but you know, hopefully this is something you guys can take home. I mean, I think there's really more planning involved here. The one thing that even my co-author, Jeff Hicks, got tripped up on, I'll show you this. This is in Accession configuration file. There are several different types of commands in PowerShell. You guys all know that, but we forget about it sometimes. An alias is a commandlet is a command, a function is a command. And so when you bring in a module to one of these things and you want to lock down what's visible, keep in mind that you specify visible aliases, visible commandlets, visible providers, and visible functions all separately. So if you make a mistake and you bring in something that's a function and you list it under visible commandlets, it won't show up. You have to take the time to look and see what type of command each thing is and make sure they get listed in the right spot. So Dave asks, oh wait, let me do Matthew's question first. Is there a way, or would you ever want to change the default configuration name because everybody knows it? I think you could run a risk of possibly breaking some built-in tools that have that in there, but I mean, I guess for the same reasons that you might want to change port numbers because they're common port numbers, you might, I guess, change the configuration name, but keep in mind the thing is already authenticating users. It's not so much about, it's not just like a port that they can hammer away at. You can only get in if you're authenticated. So I'm not sure there's a ton of upside, and there could be some downside, but I guess you could do it. Dave has a question. I'm a SQL DBA, PowerShell noob, and oops, and it just went right off. Hang on, let me scroll back up. Any advice for starting a local PowerShell group in Southeast Virginia? Any chance of getting a PowerShell Summit on the East Coast? So the PowerShell Summit is PowerShell.org's brand name for a once per year continental scale gathering of everyone. One per continent per year, that's it. The US one will probably be held in the Seattle area for the foreseeable future because that's where the team is. And the best way for us to get team participation is to be in their backyard so that they only have to leave the office for a few hours, not for a few days, because they just don't have the time. Now that said, the team has approached us about helping to coordinate groups who are doing their own events, and we've come up with a brand we're calling PowerShell Forum, which is meant to be a regional or, let's say in Europe, a national event. So think PowerShell Forum Germany or PowerShell Forum Virginia. And they would like us to sort of maintain a master calendar of these so that the team can spot opportunities where there are maybe several events back to back, so they can send someone to be out of the office for a week or so, and they can hit 3 or 4 events in that period to be a little bit more efficient. So we're trying to do those, and then we're trying to be as supportive as possible of anybody who wants to do a PowerShell Saturday. Mark Schill has offered to give some help to folks. He's done these things and has been very successful with them. I'm sure guys like Jim Christopher, who does the Charlotte one, would also offer any advice or anything he could to folks. We're going to try and surface those things so that they become visible to the team. And if folks work with us on the scheduling so that we can get several events in an area kind of back to back, then it's even more likely we'll be able to get the team to show up for those things. So I guess those are kind of the options in terms of different events. And Mike is pointing out that they are probably going to do another PowerShell Saturday in Charlotte. And again, we want to be very supportive of that. And Dave, you're right. It's funny, but the PASS is very much an organization that we are trying to model ourselves after in a couple of different ways. Doing events in that type of a structure is one of those ways. Our corporate legal structure is very similar to theirs. And part of it is because the folks at Microsoft are comfortable with and familiar with their structure. And sharing that structure helps make them comfortable with us and makes it easier for the team and other groups at Microsoft to engage with us and work with us. We don't have the resources to put on events all over the place. Just doing the one annual summit stretches the limits of what we can do. We're just volunteers, and there's only about 4 of us running this PowerShell.org thing. And you know, between the summit and the games and everything else, it's a lot. What we want to do is try and enable local to run events in such a way that the team can still get involved, and those groups will still have the national level exposure so that they can get people to show up. And we just want to help them and give them resources to do that. You know, I mentioned that we've come up with this PowerShell Forum brand that want to use it so that we can have a unified brand, but those groups can still completely own their own destiny and be in charge of themselves, because we certainly don't want to be in charge of all of that. So I mean, that's kind of our model going forward, that we're at least going to try, and then take feedback from folks and see what works and doesn't work and see what more we can offer. It's, you know, people are asking us all the time, are we going to run events here, there, and everywhere else? And if we could afford to pay ourselves a salary so that we didn't have to do anything else, sure, but we all still have to have jobs, and unfortunately it really puts a crimp on the time sometimes. But we are trying. And Chicago would be a great location. I've done classes there that were very well received. I know there's a big, you know, community there. That's even a place where I think I know enough folks at the Microsoft office that we could probably get them to help raise awareness of it in the local area. And then obviously PowerShell.org will do everything it can to help promote those things. We've got 3,000 or 4,000 people signed up for our tech letter now. We get about 100,000 hits a month. So that's often a great way to let people know that events exist, and we want to help do that if we can.
Okay, are there any more questions? Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. I moved my headset over to a different USB port. The echo is not quite as bad.
And some of that's probably from me too. I'm using the laptop's built-in microphone.
So if anybody has any questions about the scripting games that's going on, it's a great time to ask them.
Yeah, and you're doing quite well in the scripting games, Mike. You got another place?
Yeah, top 3 in both of them. So if you want to learn about PowerShell from me and learn my tricks, then come to SQL Saturday in Atlanta this weekend. And to be honest with you, you know how I'm placing so well?
How?
Reading Don's books.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess event 4 opens Thursday. Is that right?
7 p.m. on Wednesday for us.
So, okay, yeah, Wednesday. Yeah, I still have everything as Greenwich Mean Time in my head. So yeah, tomorrow evening. Yeah, it'll be 5 o'clock Pacific time. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we're getting there. We're more than halfway through now.
Hey, Ron, was there anything you wanted to ask Don?
No, I don't. I mean, I can't think of anything right now. It's a really interesting presentation. I've actually, work used it a little bit. I use it to. I've actually made like a module that behind the scenes, once you import the module, it connects to an endpoint on a server, and I use it's I guess fan-in remoting. The server has ODBC connections set up to different databases, and I have a command that uses implicit remoting to run the ODBC query on the server that people are implicitly remoting into.
And that's a fantastic use case, because all of these little remoting tricks really do work together. You can make it look like the command lives on the local machine by implicit remoting, but it's really executing on the remote machine in a delegated administration endpoint, perhaps. So it's running under a completely unknown set of credentials. And you can get quite complicated. I mean, the only recommendation I've been giving folks is when you set this sort of thing up, draw pictures and write documents so that you remember what you set up and how you set it up. Those session configuration files should be archived somewhere so that if you ever need to recreate those, that's a fast and easy way to do it. Always create these things by using a script so that the command can be saved and replicated somewhere, or at least someone can see what was done. Because it's going to be really easy as you start multiplying these for them to get out of control. And then, the auditors are going to want to come along and they're going to want to know more about it. So the other thing, every time you create one of these, have yourself a little script that just goes out and queries all of your session configurations and maybe compares their SDDL to what the SDDL is supposed to be. And if you start doing that with your first one and you just add to it as you add more, then it becomes very easy to keep that up. If you wait until the auditors realize you're doing this and then you have to go build a script to report on it, it becomes a pain in the neck. So just, kind of think about the long-term life cycle of these. They're not just a way to solve an immediate problem. They're going to become a permanent part of the environment. SDDL is the Security Descriptor Definition Language. I'll show you what one looks like. This is an SDDL. So that is a textual way of putting down an access control list. And I can't make any sense of it whatsoever, but if you use the GUI to generate one, this becomes a very easy way to copy and paste these things and compare them to each other and so forth. So that's what that is. And you can create these by specifying that string if you've already done it somewhere.
Well, and actually I don't blog very much. Mike has gotten me to actually create a blog, but I've only got like 3 or 4 posts, but 2 of them deal with taking making something that you can use. It's kind of like Get ACL, but for services. But in the blog, I actually talk about the .NET object that can take the binary form of a security descriptor or the STL form of the security descriptor and actually make a function that gives you something that looks like Get ACL, the access property that comes off of the object that you get back. So it gives you, it's not a GUI representation, but it is a human readable form, and you could actually kind of, if you figure out what the access mask looks like, what the different, and it should be very easy for this. I want to say there's only 3 options when you actually bring up the GUI. I think that, it's like, what is it, read, execute, and full control, something like that. So you can actually make something that resembles the object you get back from Get ACL, so that you can audit and modify things in the shell interactively.
Awesome. The reason the thing is to make it more command line friendly. So that's a really good interim step.